latest episode of the Modern Brewer podcast with me, your host, Chris Lewington. So this episode's going to be a wrap-up of 2024, including some podcast statistics and my top 5 takeaways of the year. So first, let's just kick it off. This year has been crazy for the Modern Brewer podcast, the first full year of recording. I've managed to squeeze in 23 episodes of the Modern Brewer podcast, generating over 32 hours of incredibly niche content. The Modern Brewer podcast has been listened to in over 80 countries, showing just how global the brewing industry really is. It's actually such a crazy number. It's actually been listened to as far out as Kenya, Nepal, the Philippines, Japan, Brazil, Argentina. It's crazy. I mean, of course, here in sunny United Kingdom, this is where the majority of listeners are, but it's still crazy to see how many listeners are around the world. In fact, this year, there's actually been over 10,000 downloads of the Modern Brewer podcast, which crazily puts this in the top 10% of podcasts around the world. Over 10,000 downloads is a crazy statistic to me. I am absolutely chuffed when I saw that number. The top 10% is also kind of crazy, but probably says more about how many podcasts don't make it than it does of those that do. But really cool to see. So yeah, I'd like to just thank every single person who's downloaded even one episode of the Modern Brewer podcast, the core listeners, or those who just pick and choose episodes that are relevant to them, which is totally understandable. Look, I really just appreciate everyone on that. I also love all of the kind words that people have shared over LinkedIn, Instagram, when I've met people in real life at trade shows or at festivals, and also the advice and feedback as well. I mean, I actually recently listened to episode 1 again, and at the end of that episode, I just stopped. There was no music, there was no summary, it was just end of episode. I don't know if we even said bye. It was awfully edited, and I remember a few of people reaching out to me after that first episode going, yeah, great episode, mate. Just maybe do something about the end. And yeah, I haven't changed it actually since then, so you can still go back and listen to it. But yeah, really funny. I feel like I've come a long way since then, but that's only because people really point out when there can be improvements made, and I'll always make them. So now it's time for me to share my top 5 takeaways from this year's Modern Brewer podcast. It's impossible to do these wrap-up episodes without standing on at least one cliche landmine, but this was genuinely really difficult to choose. At first, I was thinking of the top 5 things I think everyone should know from the Modern Brewer podcast, the best bits of information, and it was so difficult. So I kind of just went back on that a little bit and decided to pick 5 that meant a lot to me. We're going to start backwards, starting with number 5. They are in numerical order. There is a clear number 1. That number 1 sets itself miles above all the others. But before we get there, we're going to go through the first 4. So coming in at number 5 on my list of 5 top takeaways from the Modern Brewer podcast this year is an episode that was so special to me. It was the one that I did with Thornbridge Brewery. They took a huge gamble on me as a very, very young brewer looking to run their 10 hectoliter brewery on the grounds of actual Thornbridge halls. Truly, truly stunning. I had some of my most challenging times in brewing at Thornbridge Hall. But Rob, Dom, and Ben helped me through that. They helped me develop as a brewer and as a person, and I owe them a lot. And it was so cool to have Rob and Ben on the Modern Brewer podcast talking about not only how they saved one of the most iconic pieces of British brewing history, the Burton Union system, but how that interacted with their beers and how that they ingrained it into their processes. But my favorite takeaway came from when they were talking about how the Burton Union system affected one of the UK's most iconic IPAs in Jaipur. For everyone who's tried Jaipur, they will know that bitterness hits you straight up front. But how the Burton Union system slightly softened that and didn't add this really intense, complex ester profile like I predicted it would was really, really interesting to me. I absolutely love when my preconceptions or my assumptions are wrong, because it means I can learn from that. And I think it's really, really fascinating. And actually, that episode with Rob and Dom is now live on YouTube. We recorded that episode with video, so you can see me, Dom, and Rob discussing the Burton Union system. And actually, from that moment on, all the Modern Brewer podcast episodes will be live on YouTube. So go check them out, hit subscribe, and you'll never miss a videoed Modern Brewer podcast episode.
So obviously, generally when we use barrels in brewing, we're using like fresh barrels and we want to get flavor from them. And we're expecting, you know, like vanilla and all these different barrel flavors. But, you know, these barrels are 35 years old. They've been chosen for their neutral flavor profile. So it was a bit,
you're not going to get any wood.
It was strange to not get wood because all the previous time we put beer in wood is such a obvious standout flavor, that wood flavor in barrel aged beers.
Yeah, they depend on the barrel. Or spirit.
Or the spirit that's been in the wood. So to have none of that was quite interesting. But Jaipur, like people like being smacked in the face by Jaipur. Like that's one of the draws for some people. And the Union Jaipur, like I preferred it. It was softer, rounder, more yeasty, a bit more estery maybe.
Yeah.
Like I preferred it, but I don't know whether like diehard fans of Jaipur weren't weren't getting the smack in the mouth they were hoping for. So it was different beer, but it was, lovely.
Coming in at number 4 is here simply because it made me laugh for about 5 days afterwards. It's, of course, Jordan from Mash Gang. His incredible advice to brewers looking to make a non-alcoholic beer. It simply went, you are under no obligation to make any kind of pun on the name that it's low alcohol at all. I mean, what a legend. It caught me off guard. It's not what I expected. And I've been laughing about that probably ever since. So that's absolutely comfortably gotten into number 4. What a guy.
Don't take the piss out of your customer with the name of the beer. Like, I think it's incredibly bizarre to I don't want to have a beer that's like called Cucktoberfest or something, or designated dry ver, or I don't know, like sissy water or nanny state or something like that. I don't want to stand in a bar where the first thing that happens is I have the piss taken out of me by the brand. It's like that's bizarre. Don't do that. You are under no obligation to make any kind of pun on the name that it's low alcohol at all. Ever.
Number 3 on my list of top 5 takeaways from the Modern Brewer podcast this year has to be about learning on the impact of proprietary hops and the hop surplus on the iconic Hoponomics episode with Douglas McKinnon. This episode smashed together 2 of my favorite nerdy topics, which is economics and hops. Doug is the only independent voice in the entire hop industry, meaning this was the first glimpse for a lot of brewers on just how crazy the world of green gold really is. Doug talked in depth on why he thinks brewers are still required to contract hops, even though there is a huge surplus of them sat around the world. He also goes to in-depth on how proprietary hops will play a significant role in the future of brewing. To cement these learnings, Doug has an excellent delivery. The way that he imparts knowledge, the way that he can talk so well on such a complex subject that's normally filled with so much data, it blows your mind. He undercut all of that with his soft, excellent tone of voice. Since that episode, I know a bunch of people who've then gone on to deep dive into Doug's McKinnon report, which goes into all of the statistics, and you can lose a couple of evenings going into this, and they have found out all about the hop market. And for all of those people, they are changing the way that they purchase hops. Some of them don't have contracts anymore, some contracting differently, because understanding the macroeconomics of the hop industry really helps you understand how to interact with it. So that has to be my number 3 takeaway. Number 2 on my list of top 5 takeaways from the Modern Brewer podcast this year is, of course, my good friend George Wade on the topic of reaching net zero. For the people who know me, they'll know that one of my passions is sustainability. Over the last few years, George has taught me so much on this very subject. He's a thought leader in the whole of sustainability world and has a really good understanding of the brewing industry. We talked in that episode quite a lot about misconceptions, but actually one of the things that really stuck with me, just because it was such a good analogy, and I'm going to paraphrase him slightly, but it was, people were focusing on the pallet wrap until they started to get data. And then they realized it's not the pallet wrap that matters. It's actually the thing in the pallet that you're wrapping. It's quite simple, but it's actually really powerful. We tend to focus on things like pallet wrap, plastic straws, the things that you can see that is a problem. But actually, how did you make that beer? That's the much bigger question on the sustainability. Are you using a gas-fired steam boiler to boil your wort, to heat your water? That's your concern, not the fact that you're wrapping it with pallet wrap.
They were focusing on things like, the plastic poly wrap that was around the pallets, and that's what my background was in waste. So I was spending time helping people understand which bin that should go in and where it should go and how to get rid of it. And actually what I realized in my journey into it was that until you have the data on where are your emissions coming from, and you realize it's not the pallet wrap that matters, it's actually the thing in the pallet. So we've actually had that transition from brewers and generally companies going from a lack of kind of carbon literacy all the way and focusing on things like pallet wrap.
So that was definitely sat there in my number 2. It's a great episode. If you want to check it out, it'll be on YouTube very shortly. Number 1 on my list of the top 5 takeaways from the Modern Brewer podcast this year was the easiest decision I've made this year. It's the takeaway that I've talked about the most since that episode aired. I've spoken about it at events I've been speaking at, to brewers at conferences, to everyone in between. I also got a ton of messages after that episode aired in total disbelief and over this takeaway. And I feel like it just basically sparked that perfect combination of curiosity and outrage that I think is needed to make sort of a really, really engaging episode. So the takeaway came from Felix James from Small Beer when he started to talk about his dry floor policy. No spray guns, no mess on the brewery floor, and not a single floor drain in sight. Even for me, who has visited Small Beer many times, that still blows my mind. I can't imagine the uproar in the majority of breweries if you were to remove the floor drains and the spray guns from the brewery floor and people to come into work the next day. There'd be outrage. People would be like, how am I supposed to do my job? So that's why it was such a fascinating policy to have. But mainly because Felix designed his brewery like this. He designed it not to have spray guns, designed it not to have floor drains, and his brew team happily live without them.
So again, we're not using spray guns. Typically in a brewery, you walk in and a brewer is in all wet weather gear, with wellies, squeegee in one hand, hose in the other, and it's all about water. It's like, how much water can you splash around this place? Because that's cleaning, right? It's all about making things wet. Well, I learned a great trick and a great bit of insight from a bartender actually during my gin years at Sipsmith, which is that something isn't clean if it's wet. In order to clean something, you've got to wet it remove the dirt, rinse it, get it wet, and then dry it. And when it's dry, it's clean. Because microbes live in nice, warm, damp environments. Right? Breweries are warm, wet environments, and you've also got lots of malt dust in the air. You've got a nice sugar source. You've got bricks, and you've got all this wonderful porous material for things to live in, tile grout, and all this sort of stuff.
Mm.
And so what we do here at the brewery is we just keep everything as dry as we possibly can all the time, which A, is more hygienic, and B, saves a lot of water. So we do have a malt store, but instead of having the malt store up on a mezzanine where you might typically see it in a brewery, ours is on the ground level. We then move the malt up to the mash tun through an auger, and we keep the malt store as a nice, dry, dusty environment. And then we sweep it so we don't wash anything down, which is fairly typical. But we don't then allow any malt dust out of that room. In the same sense, we also don't allow any liquid. So say you've got spent yeast, hop trub. In a lot of breweries, they will let that down onto the floor and then wash it into a drain. So we don't allow anything onto the drain. And so this is where we came up with this concept of a dry floor policy. So the dry floor policy says, no water goes on the floor unless you're specifically cleaning the floor. For which we have it's a really nice little machine. We have a floor scrubber, and it puts water down it splits the water into ions first. So you get this, it's called Eco H2O. It's a nice floor scrubber that basically splits the water, puts the water down as ions so that you're not using lots of harsh chemicals, and then sucks it back up again. We use for the entire square, so we have 5,000 square foot here, so 500 square meters in the brewery. And we can wash the entire floor here one load is 40 liters, but we barely use that. It's about 20 or 30 liters to wash the entire floor. Typically in a brewery, you'd be washing just the brew house down, and you'd use hundreds, if not thousands of liters.
The brewery is spotless, and they still get to do all the work that they would normally do. And for me, these types of takeaways, this type of information is one of the reasons I started the podcast, so I can amplify those big success stories to a wider audience. And it just challenges that brewing narrative that we all have ingrained in us. So that actually wraps up this year, 2024. In the next shorter episode of the Modern Brewer Podcast, I will be going through some of the top news stories of 2024, and I'll give some bold predictions for the year 2025 and beyond. So thank you to everyone who has made this year so special to me. Just realized I have stepped on another one of those cliche landmines. So on that note, I will definitely be saying goodbye. Have a great festive period, everyone, however you choose to spend your time. And I will catch you on the next episode of the Modern Brewer Podcast.